everyone, I've got a best bits tutorial for you today. This clip is taken from my video on appliquing and adjusting the lining for your Logi pouch. I'm demonstrating how to use the Snug Fit lining template for the Logi pouch to get a lining piece that is nice and snug inside of your finished bag. I'll have a link to the full tutorial as well as the template in the description of the video. Previously, the lining that I have used for the Logi pouch is cut from the same pattern piece as the exterior, with the option to do it as a single piece that then has binding at the inside corners, or two separate pieces that are then sewn, leaving a turning hole in the middle for you to turn your bag out. The problem with using the same piece for your lining and your exterior is that it ends up a little loose on the inside of your finished Logi pouch. In order to get around that, I have drafted a Snug lining template for us to use when we are putting together our lining so that we get a less baggy finish on our Logi pouch. And you can use it if you're going to do the binding or if you are going to do a turning hole. It does have a seam in the middle. However, if you are doing the binding version, that seam will be flat. It won't create a ridge. If you were doing the turned version, you would have a ridge there. However, you can hand sew that lining closed in order to have a nice flat bottom on your Logi pouch. The way that it works is essentially by creating a dot in the middle of your lining piece. So this lining piece is cut the same size as my exterior. So if you're doing the single piece, what you would do is fold your lining piece in half, and then you will take the template and lay it on your lining piece. And we're just going to draw in this curve. We're then going to clip together the outside edges to keep everything lined up, mark the center of the side seam, and then we will just sew along the line that we have just drawn in. That will just remove some of the loose lining material. So your lining piece will not lay flat for the moment, but when you finish sewing up your bag, you will have a nice snug fit because some of the slack has been removed from the center there. If you've seen my basic boxy video or my video on the raccoon case, I use a similar technique there to reduce some of the bagginess in the lining. But you keep the measurements at the sides and around your curve the same. That's how you would do it if you were going to do a single lining piece. If you were going to use two separate lining pieces, the way that I do it is using the same template, but we're going to be drawing in the seam allowance. So first I draw in the 3/8 of an inch line for my seam allowance, and then I take my template and I draw that in also. And then I will place my lining pieces right sides together, matching up the outside edges and the sides. And then rather than sew this section here like we did for the single lining piece, I'm just going to sew this straight section until I get to the edge of the curve on both sides, and that will leave the turning hole in the middle. And once that is sewn, I will fold the lining back, and that will create a slightly curved opening, and that is what will reduce the bagginess on the lining when I finish sewing up my Logi pouch. The good thing about doing it this way is when you have sewn the side sections and pressed that out, your lining piece will still stay pretty flat, which makes it a little easier to sew to your exterior than if you were going to do this version. If you're doing this version, you're still going to turn it out through that boxed corner and then add that little bit of binding. And once you have sewn this part, you can choose to either hand sew the opening closed so that you maintain a nice smooth bottom on your Logi pouch, or you can pinch the folded edges together and sew it on your sewing machine, which would just give you this slight ridge in the bottom of your bag. So I'm sewing on that line just from the outside edge, back stitching, sewing along until I get to that mark, back stitching again, Raise the needle, come across to the other side. And now rather than fold that lining open and pressing it flat on the seam allowance, we are going to pull it out and press it down as close to that line as we can. Press the seam open at the side. And then when we're finished sewing up our bag, we will close this part up, either by pinching it together, like so, and then stitching along this opening, or by using a ladder stitch to close up the hole. We now have our lining and our exterior ready to go, so we can finish sewing up the bag. I'll have a link to the full tutorial in the video description. Hope that helps. Thanks everyone.